Next, we'll talk about Israelite society and family life. Most of this material is covered in your homework reading in the book by Carol Myers, but I wanted to highlight some of the main points here for you, and hopefully, this will drive home what's important. If you have any questions about this, please do submit those, and I'll try my very best to answer those. So, how did the average Israelite live? So, we're not talking about sort of the upper echelon of Israelite society, but more or less the average person in ancient Israel. What was their life like? Well, most Israelites practiced what's called subsistence agriculture. And by that we mean that they spent most of their life trying to grow enough food and fiber to survive, and with probably very little excess to sell or trade in order to gain additional wealth. One thing that might be surprising is that the Israelites were not nomadic. So we think of stories like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they're constantly moving around. So these are the ancestors of the Israelites. And the reason those stories are important is, and sort of the nomadic existence of these ancestors is that was very unusual. The Israelites that would have told those stories were actually very tied to the land, but they remembered ancestors that didn't have land and sort of how they had to survive by various means without land. So having land is very important. The major products that the Israelites concentrated on were grain crops, so something similar to our modern day wheat and barley, grapes and olives. So, grapes grow, if you're not familiar with it, grapes grow on vines and olives grow on trees. Grapes provide sweetening agents. Olives provide both oil for light and oil for cooking, as well as olives for eating. And then also small animal herding, sheep and goats. So, sheep and goats provide important milk. They provide material for clothing. So, the um, wool would be used to make clothing and make other materials. This is all also explained in your reading. Also, families would have had probably small gardens where they grew seasonal vegetables and so forth, but these were the main products that the Israelites concentrated on and are most mentioned in the Bible. As I mentioned, this livelihood was very tied to the land. So, if for some reason you lost your land, this was very much a threat to your survival because if you didn't have land, you had no place to grow your food, and you would have to rely on the kindness of others in order to survive. Some of the challenges in Israelite farming. If anybody has been to Israel, particularly not necessarily by modern day Tel Aviv or near the ocean, but as you drive further up into um, closer to Jerusalem, the topography gets much hillier and much rockier. And this is where Israelite culture was concentrated. So the topography is very challenging in terms for farming. This is an example of what terrace farming looks like. In other words, um, the ancient Israelites would um, sort of carve steps into the hills wherein they could plant their crops, and this was both to preserve water. As it was coming down the hill, it would land in on these steps and be better preserved. And trees and so forth would help curb erosion. So, as you can imagine, this is not the most efficient way of farming, but this is a nice photo showing olive trees under a system of terrace farming. And even the hills in the background are also have olive trees. The rarity of metal tools was a big problem. It seems that the Israelites, either by lack of raw materials or by lack of technology, did not have a lot of metal. Some of their neighboring cultures, for example, the Philistine cultures, were known for their ability to create and refine metal tools, but not a lot of metal tools in Israelite culture. And so when we read in the Bible of farmers plowing their field, this was more like a pointy stick with a perhaps metal covering at the very tip of the stick, but uh, mostly wood tools, very difficult work. Another important factor is the climate. So I don't know if anybody in this class is from California. If you are from California, you have a step up on everyone else from the class because Israelite climate is very similar to California climate. Well, what do I mean by that? Sometimes this is called a Mediterranean climate, so that's why I mentioned that on the slide. A Mediterranean climate means that there is a wet period during the year and a dry period during the year. So in California now, we have um, rain perhaps starting again in the month of October or November. And then we'll get rain on and off, hopefully, until the months of maybe March, April, perhaps a little in May. And then it won't rain again until the following fall. So there's a rainy season and a dry season. So, what does that mean in terms of subsistence agriculture? Well, if you have a drought and it doesn't rain very much in the winter and spring months, you're going to have to wait a whole nother 9 months before it even rains again. And in that intermediate time frame, if you don't have enough stored grain, your family could easily starve. This is another reason why people would keep sheep and goats, besides for their wool. Um, if necessary, in an emergency, you can always eat your sheep and goats if you don't have grain to eat, grain or olives. Of course, disease, both crop disease and animal disease, is a potential threat. And as I mentioned earlier, loss of land. So if you lose your land, you are in dire straits. So how could you lose your land? Well, one way that you might lose your land, and that's mentioned a number of times in the Bible, is people would run into problems due to a drought or other situations where they would put up their land as collateral for loans, and then if they didn't were not able to repay those loans, sometimes their land could be foreclosed, and this would basically leave them sort of in the ancient equivalent of homelessness. Next, I want to talk about more specifics about the Israelite family structure and what sociologists and anthropologists think the Israelite family looked like. Most anthropologists use a term called the Beit Av to describe the Israelite family structure. Beit Av is simply two Hebrew words that mean house of the father. And what we mean by the house of the father is that this was a household headed by a male, probably the oldest male that was still able to function. So maybe not the most elderly male, but sort of the oldest functioning male would lead the household. The household also included the extended family, so it's not the nuclear family that we are used to in the United States with a husband and wife or two spouses and children, but we're talking about extended family with relatives, grandparents, perhaps aunts and uncles, great aunts and uncles. So definitely a wider family than what we would typically see in the United States. The family household would have included sons and their wives and their families. So usually the sons would stay with the family of their father, and their wives would move in, and they would, of course, have their families. Um, Women in the household, so these would be girls that were unmarried and wives of sons. Definitely, you will get the sense after reading Myers that women were not just um, chattel property, but were very valuable participants in the household. There were, of course, children, and children would most likely begin to work at an early age, 5 or 6 years old, and so were also very valuable. So, the next time you hear a sermon that sounds like children were, I don't know, not considered all that important in Israelite society, take that with a grain of salt, please. The elderly were also part of the household. Typically, elderly would, uh, quote unquote, graduate to easier jobs. Watching sheep was probably a typical job of the elderly and also of children, because you can sort of sit around and you don't have to do hard labor and heavy lifting. The next step up would be the clan. And so extended families would probably live near other extended families to which they were related in small villages. So there's a Hebrew word, mishpacha, that uh, is usually translated as clan. Um, and then a number of clans, related groups of people, would uh, consist of a tribe, and then sometimes tribes met together in councils. There's a number of instances of this mentioned in the Bible, so where tribes sort of form a national council in a sense. As I mentioned, preservation of the land was key to survival. If you don't have any land, you don't have any food. It's important to note that the firstborn son was entitled to half the land as inheritance. So, um, sons that came along later probably had to find other um, ways of either find other ways of making a living, or were just very attached to the firstborn son in order to survive. And obviously, the firstborn son, when his father died, would probably be the new person to lead the household. Women only inherited if there were no sons, so I don't know how often that actually happened. It's important to know that girls typically lived with their husband's family, as I already mentioned. So usually girls would move out of their family of origin and go live with their husband. In exchange for the value of that girl's labor, the family received what is called a bride price, or mohar in Hebrew. So when a girl was transferred to another household for marriage, that girl's family would be, in essence, reimbursed for the value of what that girl's labor was. And then, of course, that labor could be applied to the new household. And it's important to realize that children, or maybe I should have said offspring here, are necessary for labor and for old age care. So this is not a point in history where there's any Social Security. So if you intend to survive your old age, you definitely need children to take care of you. So when you read passages in the Old Testament or even in the New Testament where there's a great deal of concern about fertility, this is why. Because if you don't have children to work for you and to care for you in your old age, this is definitely going to have a detrimental impact on your survival. And sons in particular are vital to the system. So, again, families were led by males, so having sons to eventually take over the leadership of the family was an extremely important aspect in Israelite society. So you see a lot of emphasis in the biblical text on sons and the importance of sons. And that's it for this particular section.